Welcome back, everyone. At this time, we will talk about management of firepower threat defense. Now, I want to show you how to access FTD4 configuration. There are going to be essentially two ways how we can accomplish this. One solution is going to be to use what is known as Firepower Device Manager, abbreviated as FDM, which is just a software included inside of the FTD's image. And the good thing about this solution is that it is pretty easy to access FTD using this method, because you will have just two components in the network that you will be using. It is going to be your PC, what you will use to connect to the FDM, which is going to be physically stored inside of the FTD's code. And this is going to be a regular HTTPS connection, so you will use a browser, you will connect to FTD, and you will be able to manage it. So somewhat similar to ASDM, FDM is actually a successor of old style ASA's ASDM. Okay, but this is not a recommended option for managing FTD, and I will tell you why in just a moment. First, let's take a look at a second option, second solution as how we can access FTD4 configuration, which is known as Firepower Management Center, abbreviated as FMC, which is a standalone appliance. So an additional appliance that you will have to deploy in the network that is capable of controlling multiple sensors or just multiple FTDs. Okay, so in this case, the situation is going to be slightly more complicated. Well, maybe not actually complicated, but it's going to be just different from FDM. What we will see here is that our PC this time will be connecting to FMC. And this is still going to be a regular encrypted web connection. You will use a browser to connect to the FMC appliance. And then the FMC is going to connect to your sensor. And as we will see later in this session, specifically what FMC is going to use to build a secure channel with FTD, this is known as SF tunnel, which is just a secure session build on top of TCP port 8305 by default. You can change this port number, but it is not actually recommended to do it. By default, it's going to be 8305 TCP. That's how FMC is going to access FTD. And once again, this stuff is essentially encrypted. Okay, FMC is a recommended option as how we may want to access FTD for administration because of the limitations of FDM, which is lack of support for more advanced configuration features like advanced policy settings. This is the main drawback. And the second one is that it is generally used to access or just manage a single device. With FMC, as I said, it is possible to use this appliance to connect to multiple FTDs. It's like you centralize the management and you have access to all of the features. That's why FMC is going to be, in most cases, way to go. Just a quick overview of different FMC appliances. As I said, this is going to be a dedicated unit you will have to deploy in the network. We have several choices, several physical appliances, where the only difference between them is in the amount of supported FTDs, which is supported sensors, the amount of supported hosts and users that FMC is able to store. And the third difference is in the amount of available disk space for storing events. And there is also a virtual version of FMC, FMC-V, that is able to manage up to 25 sensors, up to 25 FTDs. You can store the information about 50,000 hosts and users. This is going to be part of the so-called network discovery policy. And you can keep up to 250 gigs of events. Now, the most important thing about the management setup is going to be the proper configuration of management interfaces on both FTD and FMC. In case of a Firepower Management Center, the actual interface is going to be pre-configured with a certain IP address, like if this is going to be the physical appliance, or if you go for a virtual appliance, in this case you will provide this address during through the virtual console, like when you install FMC. So at some point when you finish the initial setup, the initialization of FMC, you will be able to connect to it using a browser, or you will be able to get to it using SSH, assuming that you allow for this during the initialization or just the installation. Now, it is still going to be possible to change the management IP address allocated to the management interface of FMC, which can be done using the configure network command. But this command is going to require special administrative rights on the underlying Linux operating system, which is what FMC uses as its underlying OS. So this is why you will have to either say that you want to access the root account, or the other option is going to be to say sudo and specify the actual command you want to run as a root. Okay, so this stuff over here, when you say sudo and then specify a command, and this is basically an equivalent of a Windows run as administrator option. When you right click on a file on an application, you might be able to say run as admin just to give it some elevated privileges. In some cases, this is going to be required to run the application. So when you say sudo and specify the command, it's basically the same thing on the underlying FMC's Linux. Okay, but maybe before we take a look at this on the CLI, let's quickly go to the GUI. We take a look at system and configuration. So I logged into a FMC in my network. We take a look at the information. The one place where it shows you what's the address of this device is here. Obviously, you can also take a look at this in the URL. But the second place is when we scroll down and get to management interfaces, it will give me some more details about the management configuration. So we see that it shows us some more information than just the IP address, which is here. It's also the name of the management interface of FMC, which is ETH0. And it also tells me what's its MAC address, and also what is the default gateway configured for the management port. You also see some short settings on this section, like DNS name, domain name, the default port used for establishing a secure connection with FTD. So you can change this option, like when I click over here, added the interface, I can change my management address over here. Now, as I said, the other way how you can do this is going to be to go to the FMC shell, like when you SSH to this management address, and notice the prompt here. It says admin at FMC, and it shows you the $sign. So this is the user name, just the user account that I used to get to this virtual appliance. And this tells me that I connected to the underlying Linux shell. So this stuff is different from iOS command line. The most notable difference is when you say question mark, like when I issue part of the command, say question mark, it is not gonna trigger the context sensitive help. It is not showing me the commands. The way you can do this on the Linux shell is by pressing the tab key twice. So this is how you can list commands that start with a certain string, or when you say a double tap on an empty line like this, it is gonna show you all available commands, all commands available on this shell. Now, when we take a look at, let's say, route. Am I able to find the route command over here? It should be somewhere there. So we see that route is one of the valid options. When I say ROU and then press tab, it is gonna finish the command syntax. But if the command is gonna be ambiguous, or just the syntax is ambiguous, it is gonna show me the options after using tab button twice. So this kind of like replaces the question mark, and you can still finish the syntax with a single tab. Okay, now if we take a look at the slide, the syntax for configuring or just changing address is actually configured as network. So if I were to say configured as network over here and try to finish the syntax, it doesn't take the syntax because, as I said, this command is actually available from the root shell, from the root account. So I have to say sudo su, like I can connect to the shell, root shell, or I can say exit and say that I want to issue this command with root privileges using this syntax. So run as administrator. And now we see I can access this command. Okay, I don't really want to change the address. I'm going to press Control C, and it puts me back to this default bash shell. Okay, how about the Firepower Threat Defense appliances? In this case, the physical management port of FTD is actually made of two logical interfaces. We have what is known as a diagnostic port, which is purely optional, and to be honest, Cisco doesn't actually recommend to use it unless you plan to send some sort of SNMP traps and syslog out of this single port. And the other one, which is mandatory, is known as management. So the physical management interface is actually consists of the diagnostic logical port and management logical port, where the logical management interface, as you can see here, is called BR1. And this is the most important of these two interfaces, because this is what we will use for administration. So when you use the FMC's GUI to push the commands to the FTD, I should say, or this is also how you can access the FTD's command line with SSH. Now, the second application of this interface is to allow FTD to register with FMC, which is actually required to be able to configure our sensor. Okay, like with FMC, this port, or just those ports, are generally configured during the initial setup. So when you use, let's say, virtual FTD, you will be able to configure this information through the virtual console. But you can also change those settings. You can use the configure network command on the FTD CLI, or you can use the FMC to make this change. We take a look at the FTD shell. It's actually different from the FMC. And now, technically speaking, there are actually multiple shells available on FTD. And I'm going to get back to this concept in just a second. Maybe just to show you that this command is actually here. Well, in case of FTD, question mark will actually trigger a context-sensitive help. So this one is much more like regular iOS. But one thing you have to remember is that you cannot abbreviate the commands. You must use a full syntax. You can still press the tab to expand the command. If I say config, let's say network, well, actually in this case it automatically expands the command. But if I were to, let's say, use this syntax, well, in this particular case it keeps expanding them, but this is not always going to be the case. Now let's take a look at the full syntax. So I would say configure network IPv4 manually. You would put a new IP address, specify a network mask, and then the gateway. So something like this. And this is how I would change the management address on my FTD. Okay, so as we just saw, it is possible to SSH to the management port of FTD. If this is going to be a new deployment, you would use these credentials, admin123 as a password with uppercase A. But there is going to be more than just one shell, a type of a shell available on Firepower Threat Defense Unit. So what we connected here, this is known as a default CLI, or just the default shell. And this is what you will use to access most of the commands that you will potentially want to issue on the appliance. So you cannot actually use those shells on FMC and FTD to do the configuration, but you can use them for troubleshooting or some sort of verification. So some of those commands will be familiar to you. Like, let's say I'm going to say show ? Show route. Now notice that it doesn't show me any routes now, even that we have a management interface. So some of those commands are taken directly from the ASA, and some commands, some of those statements are referring more to the Firepower engine. Okay, now the other of the shells is known as diagnostic CLI, which is gonna get us to the underlying ASA OS, which is sometimes referred to as a Lina operating system. So when you see the term Lina, it means that they are talking about the ASA, the code ASA data plane. And now the way you can access this as CLI is with the system support diagnostic-CLI command. So we go to the regular, or just the default shell, we issue the command system support diagnostic-CLI, and it brings us to this familiar looking prompt that kind of like resembles the user exec prompt of the ASA. So I can also say enable, just press the arrow key, doesn't use any password. You can access level 15. We can use a question mark. So most commands that you have on the ASA, you can also access them here, but not the configure terminal command. As I said, those CLIs, all of them, are not meant for configuration. They are meant for troubleshooting, advanced troubleshooting in certain cases, and for verification. So show route, show interface IP, brief. You can also say show run. Most of this syntax is going to look familiar to you. Okay, but notice that some of the syntax will not always give you the information you might be looking for. Like we see that it shows me management interface, but it says the IP address is not assigned. This is because of the architectural differences between FTD and the legacy ASA. Okay, now if you want to go back to the default shell, Control-C will not help you here. We scroll up a little bit to the system support diagnostic CLI command. It gives you a clue how you can get back to the original shell. Control-A and then D. This is how you get back to the default shell. Now there is also one more CLI mode on the FTD, which is accessible through the export command. So this one looks the same as what we saw on FMC because it's also a Linux OS, what you access here. And you can also say sudo su to get root privileges on this operating system. Okay, so this stuff is generally meant for advanced troubleshooting with tech, but I can show you one or maybe two commands that are going to be useful if you want to verify basic settings of the FTD. And one of those commands is going to be ifconfig. It is going to show you all underlying interfaces of the unit, including the management port. So we can take a look at the IP address configured on the FTD. And when we say route-n, it is also going to show us the routes configured on this device. So we have a default route that is pointing to this gateway out of the management port. And this is the local network. And then if I take a look at this on the FMC, I have config. This is the management interface of the FMC. 172.16.15, 100 in my case. And to be 100% accurate, I also need to tell you that there is one additional shell or just CLI mode, which is available on the hardware FTD appliances like 9300 series devices. But in this video series, I want to focus on FTDV and FTD image deployed on the ASAs, because this is what matches the blueprint. So we will not be talking about the differences, small differences between the different types of FTD platforms.